Welcome to Newcastle Family History Society podcasts. The Newcastle Family History Society, located on Awabakal land in Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia, provides support for those interested in family history. In this, the final episode of the series, What Are You Looking At?, Jane Ison is outlining how to locate information about the children sent to industrial schools and reformatories in New South Wales during the 1800s. This podcast will briefly outline what is contained in the Royal Commission into Public Charities, which commenced in Sydney in May 1873 and was concluded in May 1874. The podcast will focus on Biloela, the girls' industrial school on Cockatoo Island.
Extensive reporting about the Royal Commission into Public Charities appears in the newspapers of the time, and these accounts are easily read on Trove, particularly between May 1873 and June 1874. The Royal Commission was called in early 1873. It was to investigate charitable institutions operated by the New South Wales Government to discover whether what was being done could be improved. Commissioners were appointed on the 8th of April 1873, after months of turmoil and bad press, particularly, but not only, at Biloela on Cockatoo Island. It could be argued, however, that the chaos at Biloela was probably the main reason that the commission was established. The president was to be the barrister William Charles Windeyer, M.A. The other commissioners were Joseph Wearne and Richard Driver, members of the Legislative Assembly, Samuel Gould, a JP, Eyre Goulburn Ellis, Michael Metcalfe, and Charles Cowper Jr. Cowper, the Sydney Water Police magistrate, was also required to give evidence. Witnesses were called from a number of government-run institutions, including the Parramatta Asylum, the Sydney Infirmary, and the orphan schools, so details concerning the Vernon and the Industrial School and Reformatory at Biloela formed only a part of the evidence. As in all royal commissions, anyone could volunteer to give evidence. Newcastle is only briefly mentioned because George Lucas and his wife Marianne, who formed the administration at Biloela, had spent a short time in the Newcastle institution. More about the Lucases' brief stay in Newcastle may be heard in Farewell to Paradise, the final podcast of the Bad Girls series. Agnes King gave evidence about Newcastle and about her role as the matron of the reformatory. Joseph Hines Clark was not called, nor did he volunteer to appear. While the commission includes many interesting statistics about the institutions, including the Vernon, this podcast will focus on the Biloela Industrial School because after the transfer from Newcastle to Cockatoo Island, the situation in Biloela did not improve as expected and hoped. Instead, it deteriorated horrifyingly, and the Royal Commission outlines why. The resulting recommendations and evidence was printed. A leather-bound copy is held at the State Library of New South Wales in Macquarie Street, Sydney, and may be accessed on request with a State Library card in the reading room. The first pages identify the commissioners and the parameters of the commission. Then follows a summary of the names of the witnesses and the dates of their appearance. The report of the commission begins on page 39, with the extensive report on Biloela beginning on page 65. The summary of the evidence begins at page 119, and a list of those giving evidence is included. The appendix has a transcription of their evidence, and a special appendix reproduces lists of names of many children appearing in Sydney courts or admitted to the Vernon, Newcastle, Biloela, or the Randwick Asylum. For the Vernon, the superintendent, JSV Mean, and 2 staff members presented evidence. The Biloela superintendent, George Lucas, the matron, his wife, Marianne Lucas, Margaret Kelly, the schoolteacher, Frederick Kane, the former clerk and storekeeper, and now the superintendent of the Newcastle Asylum, were all called as witnesses. All the sub-matrons gave evidence, as did Charles Carper Jr. in his capacity as the Water Police Magistrate. Some of those giving evidence were recalled on more than one occasion. 2 former Newcastle Industrial School admissions and 8 Biloela admissions gave evidence. They volunteered to do so on the day the Commission went to Biloela. Their account of what occurred on the 25th of November 1873 is included later in this podcast. This evidence, some of which made its way into the newspapers, is both shocking and compelling. The chaos of the last weeks in Newcastle continued after the school was established on Biloela, and the situation deteriorated even further. The 4th Bad Girls podcast, An Angel in Trouble, includes some details of events in the Biloela Reformatory School, but escape, vandalism and riot were frequently reported about both girls' institutions on the island. In September 1871, Charles Cowper, as the Water Police Magistrate, moved to live on the island, hoping to assist in establishing order at the institution. Cowper's scathing report of what he experienced at Biloela, written in January 1872, more than a year before the commission was called, was presented as part of his evidence. Cowper wrote,
"The commencement of the new year is a fitting time to report the result of my endeavour to assist the superintendent at Biloela in accordance with the instructions conveyed to me by letter last December. I understood that the letter was written because the officers of the institution had lost all control and a succession of riots had taken place. So it was necessary to keep police resident within the walls and bring some of the ringleaders before a court where they were sentenced to imprisonment in jail. For some weeks I devoted much time to the work to satisfy myself whether this deplorable state of affairs could not be remedied. The persistent determination of the matron not to adopt my suggestions has rendered my efforts to a great extent unavailing."
Cowper listed 12 major observations, including that
The girls roamed about the island as they liked. There was no laundress, and they used the laundry for concocting and carrying out schemes for destruction. And that all inmates were locked in their dormitories at 6 o'clock every evening, and the singing and other noises between that hour and 9 o'clock was something dreadful to listen to.
Cowper arranged for religious instruction, tried to establish a reading room, and recommended that the girls be kept busy at all times, learning skills for their future lives or relaxing with activities such as crochet, reading, and board games. He objected to sending the girls to their dormitories so early and provided lamps for the dining room, but reported that the matron, Mrs. Lucas, became angry and vented her wrath on him and on the staff who volunteered to assist him. Cowper concluded that
Unless the girls are properly trained and made good servants, people cannot be expected to take them. And under the present management, where such terms as obedience and discipline are unknown, this is impossible.
the attitude of the Lucases to the welfare of their charges is very concerning. On the 5th of May, Cowper reported to the Colonial Secretary that
Mr. Lucas has sent for the water police on 2 occasions without communicating with me to assist him in putting the straitjackets on the girls. I understand that the girls were almost naked. This is hardly the way that the Colonial Secretary intended this mode of punishment should be carried out.
bearing in mind that these letters were written between January and March of 1872, I feel confident that had George Lucas known that Cowper would soon judge his ability to do his job, he would have tried harder to implement Cowper's recommendations. It must have been a monumental shock to the Lucases that Cowper became one of the Royal Commissioners just over a year after these letters were written and submitted as evidence by Cowper. It would appear that the writing was on the wall for George and Marianne Lucas. Their downfall occurred on the 25th of November 1873 when the Commissioners visited Biloela. The hugely negative publicity resulting from the incident may be read in many newspaper reports on Trove. The evidence of the former Newcastle admissions Marianne Williams and Kate Solomon, and the Biloela admissions Elizabeth Sharkey, who is erroneously recorded as Elizabeth Sharpley in the Commission account, Sarah Burke, Annie Dooley, Elizabeth Eddington, Janet Boyd and Annie Smith were the girls involved in the incident. Conflicting evidence presented by Sarah Littlewood and Bessie Moore Dangar at the request of the Lucases, accusing the schoolteacher Margaret Kelly of initiating and choreographing the entire incident, was proved to be false and did not appear in either the newspapers or in this report from the Royal Commission.
On arriving at Biloela, it was found that a number of windows had been broken in a riotous disturbance which had taken place some few days before, and that a number of the girls engaged in the disturbance were still locked up in 2 of the dormitories. One of the girls requested permission to make a statement. She complained of ill treatment on the part of Mr. and Mrs. Lucas, stating that both these officers had beaten her and had ill-treated other girls by knocking them down, striking them with a fist, a can and a broomstick, and by knocking their heads against a wall on which some caricatures of Mr. and Mrs. Lucas had been drawn. Every one of these girls bore marks of violence and asserted that they were the effects of blows inflicted by Mr. Lucas. These girls, who were between 14 to 18 years of age, were questioned closely and were consistent in the account of the treatment they had received. 2 witnesses were questioned at the request of George Lucas, but knew nothing as they had been in a different part of the institution. The girls had been locked up in a dark room that was so oppressive and foul from its closeness that they were unable to sleep. The Commission repaired to dormitory number 3, and on opening the door, 8 girls were found in a half-naked condition, and all without shoes or stockings. The room had a stone floor, was without a chimney, had every window closely boarded up, was without an article of furniture, and had a foul and sickly smell, every call of nature being there answered by its inmates. On the door being closed by the members of the Commission, it was impossible for them to see each other till accustomed to the dark. They had been locked in this room from Friday morning until the visit of the Commission on Tuesday night. Fed on bread and water they drank like dogs, from a bucket placed in the room. The Commission ordered the release of 3 of the girls, and clothing and mattresses were provided for those still under punishment. The Commission regretted to witness a most unseemly display of temper on the part of Mr. and Mrs. Lucas in the presence of the girls, on a suggestion being privately made to them that one of the windows be opened, and of adopting a more judicious method of dealing with the girls incarcerated in the darkened dormitory. Mr. Lucas, on being called upon to answer the charges laid against him, admitted that he had quarrelled with the girls about the caricatures, had rubbed their heads against the wall, and could only say that he did not think that he had knocked a girl down and stood upon her. Strongly condemning and deploring such treatment of the girls by the superintendent, we thought it our duty to communicate the results of this visit of inspection to the Colonial Secretary, on being called upon to show cause why he should not be dismissed. Mr. Lucas resigned.
And so he should. The Royal Commission was unequivocal. It recorded that
The evidence would appear to show that the measures resorted to with the view of controlling the girls were not only most injudicious, but so harsh and violent as in some instances rightly deserving to be called cruel. Though the rules of the school strictly forbid the infliction of corporal punishment by the superintendent and only allow it at the hands of the female officers, the evidence shows that the rule has been constantly violated in the most reprehensible way, and that corporal punishment has been too frequently resorted to. Remembering the character for kindness which Mr. Lucas bore before his appointment to the office of superintendent, we were slow in believing the evidence given by several witnesses. The facts conclusively prove how dangerous it is to trust well-meaning but weak and ignorant people with uncontrollable power over the helpless and defenseless.
Whoa. And so the recommendations were made, and New South Wales began to establish some meaningful changes to the way it treated children. it is still learning today. Of Biloela, the Commission was very critical, most especially of the administration, but also of the location, noting that children should never have been housed in old jail buildings that had poor ventilation with no views, that they were kept on an island that was isolated from the benefits of enabling participation in society and accessing caring support groups. It also pointed out that after all its decades of use, Cockatoo Island still had no way of storing rainwater and suffered from water shortages during dry weather when getting water to the island was expensive. The recommendations also included dismissing the Lucases, although they had already resigned, and appointing a woman as superintendent. It was recommended that the industrial school and the reformatory be separated and removed immediately from Cockatoo Island. While Selina Walker was soon appointed as superintendent, it took nearly 7 years for the institutions to be separated and a further 6 years before the industrial school was finally transferred to Parramatta. There were recommendations made to reduce the number and ages of children admitted to industrial schools and to ensure that appropriate alternative situations such as boarding out were established to help unfortunate children of all ages. It was further recommended that the Vernon be moved from Cockatoo Island and closer to Farm Cove, where it had originally been moored, and that all the boys aboard learn to swim. The findings of this commission are difficult to hear. The appalling role played at Biloela by George and Marianne Lucas is now virtually forgotten, and I continue to be shocked and astonished when I read their entry in the Australian Dictionary of Biography. This 7th podcast concludes my discussion about the major records detailing the inmates and their lives in the industrial school. Shorter letters from the Colonial Secretary's correspondence are still coming to light, and more publications are being produced that shine a light on this historic period in New South Wales. For an accurate account of life in Biloela on Cockatoo Island, Mrs. Hopkins, written by the late Shirley Barrett and published posthumously, faithfully and accurately weaves the contents of the Royal Commission's report into a fictionalised tale of life on the island.
This concludes the series about the resources available for the first industrial schools in New South Wales. The Newcastle Family History Society hopes that Jane's understandings about how to best locate and use these resources will be of benefit in your family history research. In future podcasts, accounts from descendants or researchers of individual children sent to the New South Wales industrial schools before 1900 will be shared. If you have a story to tell, Jane would appreciate hearing from you. Jane's research may be read on her website nis.wikidot.com, and she may be contacted through her site or through the Newcastle Family History Society secretary email nfhsinc@gmail.com. If you haven't already, then follow us on your chosen podcast platform and listen out for more of Jane's fascinating research of the industrial schools of New South Wales. Thanks for sharing your time with Newcastle Family History Society podcasts.